Hi everyone. This is Arabella Vanderpool. And today I'm talking to you about my project for my psych of learning class at Malone University. This is a bit of a switch up compared to what I normally put on the YouTube channel I'm going to be using to put this video on. But it was a bit easier than just throwing a Canva file into the Moodle page, so I will just be using YouTube. So, my project. Let's talk about that more. So, I've titled it Ratitoneie. Now, you might be wondering why is it called Ratitoneie? It's called this because I was using a tone with a rat, Ratitoneie. It also doesn't help that the rat I was working with, Jim, he's very smart. He definitely would sit on my head like in the movie and control me if he could. Um, that's besides the point. So let's get started on what my project for my psych of learning class was, why I was using a tone, and who's Jim, and why do I think he's so smart. So, starting with what my project started as. Now, as scientists, we know that sometimes we go and start a project and then it has to change. Whether it's the data we're finding, the hypothesis isn't right, or doesn't seem supported based off the data we've gathered. Either or, something usually happens or it goes perfectly. I was not one of those perfect situations. So, my original project was to have Jim the rat, amazing rat, very smart, have him freeze at the sound of a tone. Now, to accomplish this, we used a classical conditioning paradigm, and I wanted to take this tone and have it indicate something that would cause Jim to freeze. So we had to figure that out. Well, what causes Jim to freeze? He freezes a lot based off past history, so I thought maybe this would be a bit easier. So we started. I ran up to him, nothing. He was okay with it. We said, oh, maybe he freezes at the edge of the table because he seemed to started doing that. So we watched him, and I watched him, and soon he learned that I wouldn't let him fall off the table. I've been around animals too much, I've worked in the zoo too much, and this is a bit of a human error. I should have, but with him being 2 years old and him supposedly not wanting to jump, he did jump 3 times into my hands. So we couldn't use that anymore. Then Dr. Seifert came up with an idea during week 1 that what if we get an experimental cage and get some building blocks almost. They're pretty big blocks, they're not like Lego size, much larger. And take these blocks and have him next to it, and he'd freeze, which he froze next to the blocks, but it was very irregular. Nothing that I could get a good pattern on, and so if I were to do a classical conditioning paradigm, I would need to play the tone, or at least the tone when I put the block down. But the block was already there, so it was just indicate the block was there. So if he was freezing irregularly, I couldn't just hit the tone whenever he got to the block and then he'd freeze. Most of the time he would decide, oh, I'm not going to freeze this day and walk off. It's very irregular freezing. So I had to change it slightly. I turned the block onto more of a perpendicular set against the wall so that it was parallel against the other wall to make it like a corner, almost like a closet of sorts. To corner Jim, so he'd go in there, I'd play the tone. When he got close, he'd go in and freeze, and then he'd back out. This kind of gives him a second to go, what's going on? And freeze and be like, I'm trapped. No, I'm not trapped. So then he'd back out. It all seemed well until I got sick. When I got sick, I couldn't do as many trials with Jim, and this was about a week being sick of sorts. So Dr. Seifert stepped in and said, hey, I can help you out. Amazing woman. I love her as my teacher. She stepped in and worked with Jim for a day. But then we saw that Jim actually wasn't doing a classical conditioning paradigm. And I said, what do you mean? And I get the response of, well, Jim just seems to be doing an operant instrumental class conditioning paradigm. Almost a classical conditioning paradigm. No, that's what I would have wanted. But he switched it up, which the two can be switched sometimes, not purposefully. Sometimes one turns out to be the other, or sometimes we get a different response than expected in general. But he had switched the paradigms on us, almost. He learned differently. We didn't intend this. I didn't set it up this way. It just happened because we can't control how something learns. Now, This Jim's smart. He might have done it out of his own volition. We'll get to that later. But overall, this meant he was getting some sort of treat by being put into his cage after he did the action intended of freezing. Meaning, I had to switch my entire paradigm to something else. So, following the fun little arrow on my presentation, we get to see that my new project was having Jim sniff her rear at the sound of a tone with the aid of a glove. The glove was the reason I could do this, but we'll get into this later about having him sniff and rear. But that was the new idea. That was the goal set. How getting through that, we'll talk about that later. But overall, both exhibited a trace learning paradigm, of which we are going to play a tone to indicate something else. Our CS or even our neutral stimulus would then go before our UCS of either that block or this new glove. Jim was my participant, of course. And the new experiment would have a red square tone compared to the last one, which was, I think it was a blue triangle. Do not quote me on that. I have not looked at the past reports, but only because they aren't important for this new project that has become somewhat fruitful. But I would play this when he got to the bottom left corner of his his experimental cage, so that he would know tone play, come over here, sniff, or rear. I would do this. I would have him acclimate for a little bit inside of this cage. Then the trials would last about 1 minute, and then I would put him back into his main enclosure for 5 minutes to rest, and then repeat the cycle over and over again. So, my times, my diagrams more or less for this project. We have time 1, 2, and 3. So to do these trials, we need to make sure that Jim doesn't have any big reaction to this tone, which most animals and people even have reactions to the smallest bit of sound. You hear a thump, you're going to turn your head or ignore it unless it's repetitive. Then you exhibit some sort of habitual sense of it's over and over again sensitization. And that repeating mixed with it's happening over and over again, it becomes dull to your senses, and you realize, oh, this doesn't matter as much. Meanwhile, if it just happens once, you're a bit jumpy. You're like, oh no. So we had to make sure Jim wasn't going to get that sense of jumpiness each and every time. But we still wanted the tone to be heard. So to indicate this was being heard, we played the tone. There wasn't much of a response. He didn't freeze, rear, groom himself. Nothing out of the ordinary, but also ordinary, if that makes sense. So we had to make sure this tone didn't have any sort of connection to anything else, so we could connect it to something. This brings in the glove, our UCS. So this glove does have a connection. This causes that rearing and sniffing. More sniffing than rearing. If we move the glove upward, then Jim is more likely to go up because he wants to get a better smell of it, so he'll stand up. So pairing the two together, we end up having a tone to indicate this glove's coming, Jim approaching, sniffing said glove, and possibly rearing if we move said glove up. Usually, if he were to do it, is done so within a matter of seconds, if he's interested. But again, we'll get to why Jim's a little fickle later. So, the trials themselves were more or less this. So, first trial, first day, more or less. I averaged about 8 trials per day. A couple days I only got 2 in, but between weeks 6 and 8, I could only get 5 trials in. So, what does this mean? We had to do all those tests during trial 1 and then get them started because of how late I was and how behind. We noticed that before trials 7 and 8, Jim seemed to sniff and rear beforehand. He would rear at the corners, wondering what's going on, where am I sniffing, is this the right area? And so by the end of trial 1, it seemed like Jim had the hang of it, which was very interesting for me, because with the salience of the tone and the glove, and then how smart Jim is, it would produce quite an interesting curve later on because of how much he's picked this up. The next trial only had 2. It seemed that Jim knew what to do on the first try. He sniffed, reared, but the second try, he didn't show any interest, which was interesting for me because I was sitting there going, "Are you going to sniff? What's going on there, buddy?" The next couple trials seemed to have a pattern to it where he would perform, maybe perform sometimes before anything would even occur. But then he would also go through a patch of, I don't want to do this anymore. On day 4, we noticed that Jim froze, which was interesting because the previous trial was him freezing, not this one. So I wonder if he was trying to do something there or not. Bell talked about that in his tendencies section. But overall, we can see that the reaction time sped up overall. He not only, during some portions, besides when he was being stubborn and didn't want to do anything, he went faster. He went from, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do, to, I need to do this right away, right away. And he seems to have done that some trials, at least during the 2 trials during one, like a couple of these days. He would go do it immediately and then be done. He would say, I want this, I'm done. So anyway, speaking of that curve from earlier, here is the curve. I noticed that Jim himself was very smart. The saliences of both the glove and the tone. The glove was a lot higher than that of the tone, which is good. That's how it's supposed to be. And how smart Jim is showed more of like a 0.9 of that strength of learning. So the curve here kind of indicates something we saw before in that time, how fast he was. Though only 5 trials were performed, I did the data, I did the math for doing all 10, more or less just 10 trials. Oh, not 10 trials, 10 days worth of trials and averaging that out, which started to even out during those times through 5 through 10. It stuck between that zero point 0.7 and 0.9 range to even out almost at 0.9. So the curve was correct. I'm very happy with how it went. And it was sort of my learning moment of everything put together teaching wise in this class and this semester so far. And though sometimes I know that during some classes we are supposed to learn things and go, okay, I get this, I'm going to apply this. And you're supposed to leave going, yes, I know what to do. I didn't really see that with most of my classes, but I did for this one. I was able to see that, yes, I know what's going on. I know what to do, finally. I was able to kind of appreciate how the learning has gone in this class for me and myself. And working alongside Jim has not only shown how much I have learned, but shown how much he has learned, of course, with this graph. So, why was Jim a little bit fickle? What are some tendencies of his? Well, you'll see here, he's smart, stubborn, and a bunch of other fun things. He's very smart because he's learned very fast. I put him at about a 0.8, 0.9. I think it was a 0.8 or 9 for how smart he was. But it was a matter of he would get it mostly on the first try. Even if it was something new, he still had to figure it out. But based off the 2 days alone, he figured it out very quickly, especially on that first day. He figured it out. Even during one of the trial sets, I was like, oh, I'm going to stand up and start this trial. I pressed the tone on accident. He was right at that corner. No glove present. He was at that corner. If I had more time to work with, I could probably have gotten him to do that a bit more, maybe with more reason, because he's stubborn, as you can see next. He will do things if he gets something out of it. It sounds like selfishness, but when considering animals, you have to think of how some animals will do things to survive or out of their own wants and desires. Jim's very smart. He can pick stuff up fast, but it's a matter of, does he want to? Does he really want to? And I know putting human tendencies and different things from what humans do onto animals and saying, oh, this animal feels sad or guilty is not always an animal emotion, could be a human emotion, and we just think they feel sad because of this, but it's truly another thing causing that guilt. But I do genuinely think how smart Jim is, he just doesn't want to do it unless he's getting something out of it. which brings us to the out of trial situations where Dr. Seifert had noticed he's becoming limp in her hand as he's being moved. Normally, some rat owners might say, oh, he's just tired, but he would become limp, get a cookie, and then firm up again. Then, as soon as Dr. Seifert had said that, I put pieces together and said, he's learning as fast as he is because he wants to get something out of it. Like the operant instrumental thing. He learned it in such a way that, oh, I get to go be put back in my original cage. Yippee, this is my reward. Well, with this being said, he was looking for these rewards during possibly trials where he was just sitting there and not wanting to do anything. More of a stubbornness going, I don't want to do this, so I'm not going to because I'm not getting anything good out of it. Funny enough, people do this too, but it was just fascinating to me to see this from a rat, I guess to say. And Jim's amazing, so, and very smart, so it's very likely he was doing this, throwing some sort of tantrum in his own little way and fashion. Another interesting thing that is slightly off topic was what he did in the other trial out of the trials. Before this set paradigm, during the freezing paradigm, he would actually freeze more often. He would freeze in certain situations that were similar to that of the cage. Like if he was backed in the corner, he'd freeze more often, was what Dr. Seifert had told me. Which I was worried this would cause problems because of what freezing is with rats, but it seemed to not cause that many problems. Instead, Jim decided to cause me a problem. So, with the sniffing and rearing paradigm, with the tone, and my little Ratitoneie, what is my conclusion? What do I conclude with knowing Jim as a rat is an individual and his learning of rearing and sniffing at the sound of a tone? I learned that Jim is smart. That Jim did learn this and pick this up pretty quickly. That Jim could manage to do other things and learn and be great at other things if taught. That Jim can pick things up very easily, and if he wants to, he will do it. Probably with the aid of a cookie, a reward of some sort, and so on and so forth. So, what does this mean for working with Jim in the future? Working with rats and learning. Well, when working with Jim in the future, I want to put him to the test with possibly a maze for my operant instrumental paradigm. Because he already knows how to do that, but he's getting a reward out of this. I want him to be rewarded for it so he feels more obligated to do it. It's like taking a child to the dentist. Some parents will go, we can get a nice treat after this. Then the kid wants to go and get it done and over with, unless the act of going outweighs that of the reward. Which hopefully, if we do a maze, it won't do this. But we never know because Jim throws us curveballs. When working with rats in general, you never want to underestimate them and how smart they are when it comes to most organisms. Brain development and how they've between different animals. No animal specifically is stupid in its own right. I've heard this from another student saying which one of the animals in the zoo is not the smartest. And I can't understand why someone could ask that question because all animals are smart in their own right and their own ways. Humans are smart in their own ways too. If one person is smart in astronomy and then asked to create this accumulative curve, they might not know how right away because that's not where they're smartest in. And they're smartest in their own way to either be like survive or because they want to learn that. And so by comparing that to animals and saying, is a snake smarter than a rat? In its own way, yeah, it's smarter than a rat. But rats are also smarter than snakes. So comparing the two is very, I don't know what the word to describe is besides not the greatest way to describe how smart animals are. They learn in their own ways and fashions, and they have their own capabilities and capacities of learning. So when it comes to individuals, they might know more than other individuals. Like Jim, when he was younger, he was smarter than some of the other rats. That doesn't mean that he's going to have a better capacity and max of learning than other rats. in the vivarium. But either or, when it comes to learning with anything, it's you have to understand the individual and what they've previously been taught in order to further their knowledge now. And we, as humans and stewards, can control a lot of situations and animals and other people, but we don't, because compassion exists, understanding that we can do all these things, but limit ourselves is the best thing humans can do as a whole, because we were kind and compassionate and caring. And those who work with animals, like with the rats at the vivarium, we understand their limits, hence the rests. We understand that they might not be able to do certain things, or they might learn something entirely different, and we have to change for that if we want to gain something out of it. So my conclusion is Jim is very smart. The way I worked with Jim, to the best of my capabilities, was to the best of my capabilities with how smart he was. Kind of a Pinky and Brain situation where he would say, I want to do this. I went, okay, I'm going to try not doing that, but we can go along with what you want, because if I want to get results, I need to try to get him to do something, which he did in the end and showed how smart he was through how fast he picked it up, but his stubbornness was in the way, more or less. So future work, hoping to work with him in a maze, give him some sort of treat, and work with his stubbornness, and possibly give him more of a wanting for a reward than not wanting for the work. So I hope this helped. I hope this made sense. I hope this was right and correct. Um, and I hope you can learn something today, because I always want to help people learn, whether it's about myself, the world, or even Jim the Rat. So have a wonderful and blessed day, and stay safe and warm. Bye.